Southern Asia. This paper was originally drafted together with Professor Kipgen. Unfortunately, Professor Kipgen passed away due to COVID complications. So we express our condolences to his family, colleagues, and also to Mr. Malhotra for the loss of Professor Kipgen. And to give the floor to Mr. Ankit Malhotra for the OP Jindal Global University, and he will present a paper about the title India-China Power Rivalry in Southeast Asia. So, Ankit, the floor is yours.
Greetings to one and all present. Before I begin, I would like to thank IPSA for giving us young students and research assistants to present our thoughts and papers. Uh, I would also like to take a moment to remember Professor Dr. Nagin Pao Kipkin, who fought an arduous battle with the global pandemic that has devastated our generation. The center which he created, the center of excellence which he created, and the memory of it, and the scholarship of it, which I have combined and also co founded as a result to further his scholarship and my interest in the Jindal Society of International Law. Since this was a paper written with a professor, there's only one fitting tribute that can be given to it by dividing the paper into 5 lessons. These lessons also represent the five takeaways from this article that I had written with professor. These also represent the tete-a-tete of the status quo and the theater of supremacy in Southeast Asia. I shall discuss each of these in detail and would like to jump right into it. The first one, in order to give a factual background and a backdrop of the situation in which we find ourselves in. Commonly now used as a theoretical framework, this Thucydides trap, as difficult as it is to pronounce, is as easy as it is to understand. That is because this represents a natural and inevitable chaotic event that occurs when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. The world has never seen anything like this in the rapid tectonic shift that China has caused in the current status quo. The most defining question of this trap represents this increase of globalization and the $1 million question, i.e., when will these two nations go to war and how will this get played out? But before we do that, before we jump into this discussion, let us understand the Chinese perspective which represents the situation. And the best perspective to do that is to look at it from the South China Sea Arbitration Award issued by the Permanent Court of Arbitration on understanding the definition of island as enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But let us also remember that this region is responsible for 80% of China's crude oil which passes through this region. It is also estimated that this region of South China Sea represents the dilemma that has faced and engulfed these regions. We've all witnessed how pernicious a Suez Canal issue can be. Imagine something unfolding in this region. The second example which I would like to refer to, which has been increasingly becoming popular as well, is this emergence of this Cold War 2.0. Writers like Neil Ferguson, Jared Diamond, and Ian Morris suggest that a Cold War, as long as it doesn't turn hot, is extremely useful. That is because they believe that this furthers the ambitions of humankind writ large, because this allows for technological advancements, military capabilities, and others to be advanced at an exceptional rate. This is best explained in the United States of America National Security Strategic Paper of 2017. Please bear in mind that this paper was actually written in 2018 and 2017, so it represents a view and a perspective based on that understanding. The paper, on the other hand, represents the understanding and nomenclature referenced by the United States to China and Russia as revisionist powers. By doing so, they create the clouds they create the clouds which gather moss to suggest these Cold War tussle between nations. This paper also represents a confrontational construction of the two main theaters of conflict of this dispute, i.e., the Indian Ocean and also the Indian Pacific, or the Indian Pacific and the Indo-Pacific region. With that factual background, let us now discuss these possible areas of collaboration between India and ASEAN, because this, according to scholars, has been referred to as the balancing criterion which can be used in order to combat the power tussle between these two nations. Possible areas of cooperation, you might ask: infrastructure alliance to begin with, terrorism, piracy issue, refugee crises, and environmental cooperation. Since time is not on our side, I shall not discuss these in depth, but before I move forward, I would like to highlight one of these issues, that being of piracy. Piracy has engulfed the Southeast Asian region until the Horn of Africa as a major issue. It also resulted in a politically charged case at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea between India and Italy. Now, we've distinguished and understood these areas of cooperation, but what is India doing about it? Well, the answer is quite straightforward. India, like ASEAN, the ASEAN members, is not a recent phenomena. These are nations, these are states, these are territories in the most common sense, which have been influencing each other in terms of culture, politics, history. Let me give you one example: the Angkor Wat in Cambodia or the Borobudur in Java. These are examples of Indian history and Indian architecture in Southeast Asian countries. I also reflect upon and remember what Rabindranath Tagore said of Southeast Asia in 1927. He said, and I quote, "I see India everywhere, but couldn't recognize it anywhere." End quote. Such is the relationship between these two nations and between these two groups. In the modern 21st century, this relationship is encapsulated in India's initial Look East policy and now Act East policy. To build upon this further, India is a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum, Council for Security in Asia Pacific, and also in sectoral dialogue partnerships in three key areas, those being investment, trade, and tourism. India also has an observer status in the Western Pacific Naval Symposium. For Southeast Asia, India is important for one simple reason. As I suggested earlier, this also influences its relationship with the United States of America. India is viewed by ASEAN and these other parties as a balancer. Let us now discuss what the relationship has been over the past couple of years between India and ASEAN. This economic role can be classified on three bases. This is something I borrowed from another paper that I had written under Professor Kipkin. This is based on three factors, those being connectivity, trade, and economic integration. While on paper these might sound extremely interesting and intriguing, however, the India ASEAN trade has been abysmally low in comparison to China. Let me give you figures. India's trade with ASEAN stands at 72 billion US dollars, whereas ASEAN China trade stand close to 450 billion US dollars. Given this lack of trade, India adopted a more powerful and aggressive policy, which was India's Act East policy. This can be classified on three primary bases, those being India's approach towards the region as an Act East policy on three grounds, which are respecting the salient features and the core values of the economic architecture of ASEAN, engaging with countries such as Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam as a strategic priority given to these regions, and also connecting with the rest of Southeast Asia on bilateral terms. This is again going above and beyond the call of order to establish and to solidify and cement this relationship. It can also be understood that India's Act East policy is a counter reaction to China's Belt and Road Initiative. China is the largest trading partner for ASEAN, which makes it a major stakeholder in Southeast Asia. I shall return to this point at a later slide wherein I talk about this point in detail. Let us also recollect that Singapore has become an important center of dispute resolution, and especially high level, high demand dispute resolution cases as opposed to going to the courts is an important factor which has driven Singapore but has also made India as an important aspect of this relationship and this dichotomy. So, this is the position where we stand, and to offer another example to solidify this relationship that India shares with ASEAN countries, on a diplomatic level, all members of ASEAN heads of state were called to the Republic Day celebrations in 2018. This might not seem as significant as a trade deal, but it signifies a long lasting traditional and homogeneity between nations, which wherein India deems it important and necessary to refer to these nations. Given this backdrop, let us now look at what happens when a nation such as China or the United States becomes increasingly powerful in terms of its prowess economically and financially. The 2018 country reports on human rights practices refers to China multiple times, but these references are not for credit or for praisal. It is rather to distinguish the practices that China has adopted, those being of a social credit system, those being of highly professional levels of surveillance and other pernicious programs which have been adopted by the Chinese government to control its citizens, their freedom of speech, their freedom of expression, and also their freedom of congregation. Amnesty International has gone as far as to say that human rights in China under Xi Jinping is worst since the Tiananmen crackdown. These and some these and some have been noted by scholars as quoting China as a ringleader globally in actions designed to erode universal human values. So now we can contrast between the international human standards and the Chinese practice. Given this backdrop, now let us look at what the ASEAN countries have done in order to curtail this, or even if they have curtailed this. The picture is quite shocking. That is because the Southeast Asian countries have turned a blind eye. Why have they turned a blind eye is the moot point of at least this passage. That is because economic driven financial benefits override moral and human rights perspectives. China follows a very simple policy. The flag follows trade. What that essentially means is that your internal policies, your moral standards take a backseat in terms of their comparison to trade and financial purposes. Let us also not forget the Monroe Doctrine that the Americans adopted. China does have a similar model when it comes to its foreign policy. That is because, scholars have noted, it is difficult to achieve a global status of power without first becoming a dominant one in its own region. This can be best understood in the cases of three countries in this ASEAN region, those being Philippines, Thailand, and Malaysia. These countries, during China's economic growth, were struggling. But as soon as China started to gain traction, so did these countries. And Philippines, for instance, now boasts the second fastest growing economy in Asia. Malaysia has posted its best figures over the past 2 years. All of these have been fueled by China. This also underlies China's dominance in the region as an increasing power and its increasing influence in the region. The last point that I mentioned on this slide is Belt and Road Initiative. What about SOL? SOL is simply something that I've learned quite recently. It stands as an acronym for shit out of luck. So is ASEAN and is this region shit out of luck? Only time will tell us. But to conclude, what I would like to offer is capitalism and its pernicious tendencies as a theoretical framework enable countries or push countries to adopt a very skewed approach when it comes to its international standards. We have seen history play out in the Southeast Asian region, in the Asian region writ large. India in the 21st century is adopting policies which are pernicious one after the other in its policies to segregate and discriminate. But these increased engagements and the political theaters of the Indo Pacific and the Indian Ocean are only set to increase. Initiatives and foreign policies like Quad do present perspectives to curtail this. But China in the 21st century is a force to be reckoned with. I recollect what Professor Kipgen said, and I will close after this. A country, while it's growing, Professor Kipgen quoted Deng Xiaoping, who said that keep your eyes below, keep your eyes down, and bide your time. But when the time is right, you must stand up to those giants who stand in your way. And that is exactly what is going to be played out. Nevertheless, this still remains the perspective of nations beyond the South Asian region. With those words, and also remembering Professor Kipgen, I would now like to close. Thank you so much. Question which you asked, Megha. See, to my mind, the madness that came about with the Trump generation did have some methodology to it. What it essentially asked for was a system of equitable pushing of resources into the pool. When the Trump administration pulled out of the WHO, who did it hurt? It did not hurt first world countries. It hurted third world countries who were already struggling with poor health and administrative functions. So, how do we counter that? The counter to that is not by going to the General Council or the General Assembly or to a pool of nations. It is rather by creating specialist pools. It is by creating specialized organs within the United Nations system which can deal with these issues. The Japanese do a fantastic job with peacekeeping operations. The Indians contribute immensely to these peacekeeping operations. Other first world countries have now started to send resources, financial resources, as opposed to human resources. Why doesn't the United Nations and the Security Council have special forces designed specifically for these purposes as opposed to going to a general body and then asking for a claim? One of the professors in our university, Professor Dr. Weston Popowski, has written a position paper on exactly this. He says that there should be special councils within the Security Council. The United Nations and the veto power is not going to go. We have to admit that as a fact. How do we reconcile with that? We reconcile with that by creating special councils focused on the developmental goals which are set up by the United Nations itself. That, to my mind, is a precise answer to the problems posed to this century. Multilateralism only works when all countries have a lowest common denominator. If that denominator is not same, there will be a tussle, and if that tussle is aggravated, then countries will pull back in an isolationistic uh, sense, which is the end of multilateralism and globalism. Propagate its reform. What I suggest is its expansion. Its expansion with the backdrop of understanding that having multiple security councils, keeping in mind the Central Security Council's veto power, is not going to harm them. Their main point of contention is their Security Council's veto power. We are not taking away the veto power from them. The only point we are suggesting is that we have multiple security councils on specific topics like health, like peacekeeping. So that's point one which I wanted to make. And I have specialized committees dealing specifically with those issues. This way, you don't disturb the equilibrium which is so dear to them. The second point which I wanted to mention is that Brexit represents a very singular example of social change. Although it doesn't represent a holistic image, look at what it has done to Ireland. Look at what it has done to Scotland. It has perturbed these regions into becoming those aggressive parts of the United Kingdom, which for so long were dormant. It doesn't represent social change in an isolationist perspective. That is because the United Kingdom is now going to go to each and every country and come to a bilateral agreement with them. Like no person is an island, the United Kingdom, although an island, cannot survive on its own. That's just a fact of this globalized perspective and globalized world that we live in. So Brexit in its core argument is flawed. And with respect to nationalism, nationalism has become synonymous to the understanding of it as patriotism. Now, patriotism to an Indian takes at least me back to the independence days. And this is the perversion which has happened at least over the past decade. Patriotism and the feelings for your country have become as tools or as modus operandi to fight those who are, well, perhaps part of the same citizenry mechanism as yours. But this feeling, which has been exacerbated again on the basis of economics and social inequality, to become these features of differences. There is nothing really different about nationalism, patriotism. Nationalism is just a perverted vision of patriotism. These represent the ideas which are used in order to create these social differences. Uh, those are the 3 points that I want